A single whispered word could decide the fate of an empire. This is the hidden power of the royal interpreters, the medieval linguists who secretly shaped history from the shadows. We will explore the startling story of a 12th century peace treaty that nearly collapsed because one translator softened a sultan's threat, altering the course of diplomacy forever. By the end of this journey, you will understand the 5 covert tactics these figures used to manipulate wars and treaties between rival kingdoms. How did a translator's creative explanation spark generations of conflict? What drove these individuals to risk everything by bending the truth? We will uncover the clandestine strategies and profound ethical dilemmas faced by these masters of controlled communication. To hold the power of words, this immense responsibility fell to a select few individuals whose very identities were shaped by the turbulent world they navigated. The royal interpreter was rarely born into the role. Often, they were scholars plucked from monastic libraries, merchants whose trade routes had gifted them a dozen languages, or even former diplomats captured in conflict and given a stark choice: serve or face a far less comfortable fate. Their training was not found in any classroom. It was forged through years, sometimes decades, of total immersion. To truly master the language of a rival empire, one had to learn its poetry, understand its jokes, and sense the subtle shifts in tone that signaled respect or grave insult. They became living repositories of cultural nuance, knowing that a mistranslated proverb could be as dangerous as a misplaced army. This deep, intimate knowledge placed them in a position of impossible power and profound vulnerability. A king or sultan had to trust them with every secret, every private thought meant for a foreign ruler's ears. Yet that same monarch could never fully trust someone who so perfectly understood the mind of the enemy. Every whispered conference behind closed doors was shadowed by this unspoken question: how could anyone be certain the bridge was not also a gate left open for the other side? The interpreter's first and most elegant weapon was not a lie but a silence. In the high-stakes theater of royal negotiation, what was left unsaid could be more powerful than any shouted demand. This was the art of selective omission and strategic editing. Picture the scene. A Frankish king, his face flushed with righteous anger, dictates a message for the Mongol Khan. His words are laced with threats, insults, and impossible ultimatums. The interpreter, standing quietly, absorbs every venomous syllable. His mind races. To translate the message verbatim is to deliver a declaration of war, and likely earn a swift execution for being the bearer of such fury. So he makes a choice. He carefully pares away the most inflammatory phrases. The king's threat to raise cities becomes a firm request for restitution. The personal insult to the Khan's lineage simply vanishes into the air between them. The interpreter presents not the raw message, but a refined, more diplomatically palatable version. His goal in that moment is not betrayal, but survival and the prevention of a catastrophic breakdown. This practice required a psychologist's understanding of human temperament. An interpreter had to know each ruler's pride, their triggers, and the precise point at which a perceived slight would become an unforgivable act of aggression. They became editors of reality, controlling the emotional temperature of a dialogue by filtering its content. A powerful example comes from the tangled negotiations between the Holy Roman Empire and the Papal States in the 13th century. During a critical discussion over territorial rights, a papal cardinal included a subtle, yet deeply loaded, theological critique within his legal argument. It was a poison pill wrapped in scripture, meant to undermine the emperor's divine authority. The imperial interpreter, recognizing this theological landmine and fearing it would derail the entire peace process, simply omitted it. He translated the legal framework flawlessly but left the doctrinal jab out of his report. The agreement was signed, but its foundational subtext was utterly altered. The emperor believed he had won a clean political victory, unaware of the spiritual challenge that had been silently erased from the record. In this shadowy craft, a strategic silence was never an empty space. It was a deliberate construction. By withholding a volatile phrase or softening a harsh tone, these interpreters weren't just avoiding conflict. They were actively writing a new, less dangerous script for history to follow. They understood that sometimes to build a bridge, you first had to leave certain stones unturned. This power to shape narratives through omission set the stage for their next, even more audacious maneuver. If you could edit the message, what was to stop you from improving upon it? But the power of silence was only half the equation. The true artistry of the royal interpreter lay in the music of the message itself, in the subtle dance of tone and nuance. Words carry meaning, but tone carries intent, and these masters of language understood that how something was said could completely redefine what was heard. This was the second covert tactic, the art of paralanguage manipulation. Pitch, pace, volume, hesitation. These were the invisible brushes with which an interpreter painted perception. A direct command from a Byzantine emperor, harsh and guttural in its original form, could be rendered in the interpreter's voice as a polite, almost regretful suggestion to the Venetian envoy. Conversely, a rival sultan's carefully measured query, laced with diplomatic hesitation, could be delivered to the council as a firm, demanding ultimatum. The dictionary definitions remained perfectly accurate, yet the emotional charge of the exchange was utterly transformed. This required the acute sensitivity of a performer, a person who could read the temperature of a room in an instant and adjust their delivery to either soothe or inflame. They became unseen conductors, orchestrating the emotional undercurrents of statecraft with nothing but the inflection of their voice. A powerful case emerges from the long and bitter conflict of the 100 Years' War. During a tense 14th century ceasefire negotiation between England and France, chroniclers of the time noted a curious and persistent pattern. French lords reported that their English counterparts seemed belligerent and unyielding, their statements dripping with contempt. English nobles, however, recorded that the French were being oddly evasive and disrespectful. Some historians now suggest the interpreters themselves may have been a hidden source of this friction. It is possible that, whether out of national loyalty, personal bias, or simply a desire to keep their own lord on high alert, these translators performed a subtle act of vocal sabotage. They may have delivered their own king's words in measured, conciliatory tones, while rendering the enemy's statements with a sharper edge, a quicker, more aggressive pace, or a dismissive lilt. No factual lies were told, but the atmosphere was poisoned drop by drop. Every slightly hardened consonant, every impatient sigh woven into the translation, fed a narrative of hostility. This manipulation of nuance was devastatingly effective because it was so difficult to detect. A ruler could challenge a mistranslated word by consulting a dictionary or another scholar, but how does one prove a tone was too harsh? How do you document a pause that felt intentionally insulting? The interpreter's performance lived and died in the moment, leaving only its consequence, a deepened mistrust, a negotiation pushed closer to collapse. In this shadowy realm, the truth was not just in the text, it was in the breath between the words, and by controlling that breath, these figures could make peace sound like war, or war sound like an unfortunate misunderstanding, all without ever changing a script. This delicate control over perception, however, would soon face its ultimate test when the words themselves had to be invented from whole cloth. Yet beyond the music of the voice lay the very architecture of thought. The third and perhaps most profound power of the royal interpreter was the ability to build from the ground up the cultural bridges over which ideas would travel. When two worlds collided at the negotiating table, they brought concepts that often had no parallel in the other's language. Words like divine right, tribal blood oath, or sacred sovereignty carried entire universes of meaning that simply did not exist elsewhere. In these moments, the interpreter was granted a terrifying creative license. They could not translate directly, so they had to invent to find the closest approximation. And in that gap between meaning and approximation, they could reshape reality itself. This was the tactic of creative cultural explanation. An interpreter faced with an untranslatable idea would reach into the listener's own cultural framework and select a familiar concept, even if it was a poor fit. The substitution was seamless, but the intellectual shift was monumental. A powerful example illuminates this shadowy craft. During the complex negotiations between Christian kingdoms and Moorish emirs in medieval Iberia, a critical stumbling block often emerged around land tenure and legal authority. An Islamic legal term, often rendered as a trust or a sacred custodianship granted under divine law, would be discussed. For a Moorish ruler, this concept was spiritual, communal, and bound by a specific religious framework. A Christian interpreter, seeking a term his Frankish lord would instantly understand, might reach for the feudal concept of a fief, a parcel of land granted by a lord to a vassal in exchange for military service. On the surface, it seemed a workable parallel, a way to make the foreign familiar, but the substitution was a trap. A fief implied a hierarchy, a subservient relationship to a superior lord. The original Islamic concept carried no such inherent subordination. By planting this familiar yet flawed idea into the treaty documents, the interpreter, whether intentionally or not, seeded generations of conflict. The Christian king believed he had secured a vassal, while the Moorish emir believed he had entered a partnership of mutual respect under God. The resulting confusion over obligations and authority fueled disputes for decades, all born from a single, creative act of translation. This power extended far beyond legal texts. It applied to every gesture, every gift, every ritual. A deep bow from a Japanese shogun's envoy, a sign of profound respect within a rigidly codified society, could be explained to a brash European prince as an act of submission and inferiority. An elaborate, symbolic gift from a step-con, meant to honor a shared future, could be framed as a trivial bribe or a sign of weakness. By acting as the sole decoder of an alien culture, the interpreter held intellectual sovereignty over the entire relationship. They could fabricate context, making the noble seem absurd or the hostile seem gracious. Their agenda, whether born from loyalty, prejudice, or simple self-preservation, became the lens through which an empire viewed its rival. In this role, they were more than linguists, they were world builders, constructing the very understanding upon which peace or war would be decided. With such control over meaning, the line between interpreter and strategist began to blur entirely, leading to an even more direct form of influence. But these careful constructions of tone and meaning could shatter in an instant. When the survival of a kingdom or a personal ambition hung in the balance, some interpreters abandoned nuance for a far more dangerous game. They reached into the heart of a sentence and swapped out its core, deliberately mistranslating a single, pivotal word. This fourth tactic was linguistic alchemy of the highest stakes, where one term could redefine an entire empire's future. Getting caught meant more than disgrace, it meant a swift and certain end. Yet the potential reward, the power to redirect history with a whispered synonym, proved an irresistible temptation for some. The most perilous targets were always the foundational words, the pillars of any agreement, legal, territorial, and religious. An interpreter serving a proud Byzantine emperor, humiliated by the demand to pay annual sums to a step-con, might translate the harsh term tribute into the softer, more ambiguous word gift. On the surface, the flow of silver and silk continued unchanged, but in the halls of power and the records of history, the emperor had preserved his dignity. transforming an act of submission into one of magnanimous diplomacy. Conversely, a term like vassal, carrying the heavy weight of feudal obligation and subservience, could be quietly rendered as ally, a partner of equal standing. This semantic sleight of hand obscured a true power dynamic, allowing a ruler to sign a document he would have otherwise rejected outright. To execute this required a mind that was both a scholar's and a general's. The interpreter needed an intimate map of the linguistic battlefield, knowing precisely which word was the keystone holding up the arch of the negotiation. Pull it and the entire structure would tilt in their patron's favor. A purported case from the fragile Crusader states illustrates this gamble's devastating potential. During a tense ceasefire negotiation, the Arabic term Hudna was put forward. In its Islamic legal context, a Hudna is a truce, a temporary cessation of hostilities, often for a period of 10 years or less, allowing for respite but not implying a final resolution. It is a tactical pause, not a permanent peace. Yet, according to some chronicles and later scholarly analysis, the Latin translator for the Crusader lords rendered this concept with a term that conveyed a lasting, binding peace. The semantic shift was catastrophic. Believing a permanent settlement was secured, the Crusader forces let down their guard, perhaps dispersing troops or neglecting fortifications. The other party, however, operated under the clear understanding of a temporary armistice. When the Hudna's term concluded, they were legally and morally prepared to resume hostilities, potentially catching their opponents in a state of vulnerable complacency. Whether this specific mistranslation was an error of understanding or a deliberate act of deception remains debated by historians, but the principle it reveals is chillingly clear. In the hands of a manipulative linguist, the very idea of peace could be weaponized. A temporary ceasefire could be sold as a final surrender, or a minor territorial concession could be inflated into a grant of sovereignty. This was the riskiest form of the craft, a direct forgery of reality's blueprint. It asked a terrifying question. If you cannot trust the words on which a treaty is built, what can you possibly trust? This descent from subtle influence to outright fabrication forces us to confront the ultimate motivation. What would drive a person to take such a mortal risk? This final tactic relied on the inherent fog of language itself. Beyond outright lies and creative substitutions, the most cunning interpreters mastered a subtler art, exploiting the natural ambiguity and deceptive echoes between tongues. They turned linguistic traps into strategic weapons, using false cognates and vague phrasing to create a perfect, deniable smokescreen for their influence. False cognates are words in different languages that sound remarkably similar but carry entirely different meanings. For a royal interpreter, they were a gift, a built-in excuse for a mistranslation that just happened to benefit their patron. When challenged, they could simply throw up their hands, blaming the notorious complexity of their craft. Who could prove it was not an honest mistake? A compelling example emerges from the bustling ports of the Baltic Sea during the 14th century, where the commercial powerhouse known as the Hanseatic League negotiated fiercely with Scandinavian kingdoms. A critical term was often at the heart of these deals. In the Germanic dialects of the Hanseatic merchants, a word sounding close to Statecraft referred to an exclusive trading right, the privilege to be the sole handler of certain goods in a port. In Old Norse, however, a similar sounding term related more closely to a land lease or a temporary docking agreement. The sonic resemblance was a ticking time bomb. An interpreter favoring the Hanseatic side could confidently translate the discussion as being about permanent, exclusive trading rights. The Norse representatives, hearing a familiar sound, might believe they were only granting a renewable lease for warehouse space. Decades of bitter dispute over port access and economic control could, and did, spring from this single, exploitable echo. The interpreter did not invent a new word. They simply chose the most advantageous interpretation of a sound. This practice extended to deliberately cultivating ambiguity. A carefully crafted clause in a treaty, perhaps stating that a border would run to the ancient oak grove, could be left beautifully vague in translation. The interpreter would know full well there were 3 possible groves, each claimed by a different noble family. By not specifying which one, they embedded a future crisis into the document, a loophole their lord could exploit years later when stronger. When the inevitable conflict arose, the interpreter's defense was always ready. It was an unfortunate ambiguity, a tragic misunderstanding born from the imperfect marriage of 2 great languages. They stood not as manipulators but as humble servants caught in the impossible web of words. This was the ultimate camouflage. It transformed the interpreter's greatest vulnerability, the sheer difficulty of their task, into their most durable shield. They weaponized the very reason they were needed, the gap between worlds, and then hid within it. So we arrive at the central, unsettling question shadowing every whispered conference in every candle-lit chamber. Why, what powerful motives could compel a person to balance entire empires on the tip of their tongue, risking not just their life but the peace of continents? The interpreter's notebook held more than vocabulary lists. In the shadows of the negotiation hall, their role underwent a profound and dangerous transformation. Beyond the careful choice of words lay a second clandestine duty, one that turned every diplomatic mission into an intelligence operation. The interpreter was not merely a conduit for speech, they were a living, breathing spy. Their unparalleled access was their greatest weapon. Traveling within a foreign court, they moved through spaces forbidden to ordinary envoys. A Byzantine interpreter accompanying his emperor to the Sultanate of Rum did far more than translate formal greetings. His eyes, trained to notice detail, would scan the architecture of a fortress, noting the thickness of walls or the placement of gates. His ears, finely tuned to the language, would catch fragments of hushed conversation between rival princes, overhear complaints about supply shortages from junior officers, or sense the subtle currents of dissent among the nobility. He absorbed the mood of the city, the readiness of the soldiers, the whispers of the bazaar. Every piece of information, no matter how trivial it seemed, was a potential key to understanding the enemy's strength and weakness. This intelligence did not stay locked in his mind. It was meticulously recorded, often in the same notebooks that held his linguistic notes, disguised amid verb conjugations or poetic verses. Upon returning home, his report to the royal spymaster could be as valuable as the treaty he helped negotiate, if not more so. The knowledge of a weakened garrison or a simmering rebellion gave his patron devastating leverage at the next round of talks. A ruler could then make a demand or offer a concession with terrifying precision, knowing exactly how much pressure the other side could bear. This created an impossible conflict of interest woven into the fabric of the role itself. Was the interpreter's primary duty to build a bridge of understanding, or to scout the far shore for vulnerabilities? Could true communication ever flourish when every sentence exchanged was also being mined for strategic advantage? A remarkable story from 13th century Europe illustrates this duality with chilling clarity. During the terrifying Mongol invasions that swept into Central Europe, a multilingual monk served the Kingdom of Hungary as an interpreter and liaison. His holy orders and scholarly reputation granted him a perception of neutrality, allowing him to move with relative freedom. In this capacity, he was tasked with communicating with Mongol commanders, perhaps to negotiate ransoms or temporary truces. But his true mission, sanctioned by the Hungarian crown, was one of espionage. He used his face-to-face access to observe everything. He estimated the size of the Mongol forces, noted the types of their siege engines, and studied their logistical methods. Most crucially, he listened for any information about their future plans or internal divisions. The intelligence he gathered was far too sensitive to send by ordinary messenger. So he employed a brilliant cipher, hiding his military observations within seemingly innocent religious correspondence. A prayer for safe travel might contain coded details about a commander's intended route. A commentary on a biblical verse could conceal estimates of troop numbers. Through these coded letters, he funneled critical information back to Hungarian defenders, potentially saving countless lives and shaping the kingdom's desperate resistance. His story reveals the ultimate paradox of the royal interpreter. They were the essential link for dialogue, yet their very success in that role depended on their skill as a deceiver. They had to build trust to exploit it. Their notebooks, filled with both linguistic nuance and military secrets, became some of the most valuable and dangerous documents in the medieval world. This blurring of roles leads us to the final, most personal layer of this hidden history. What kind of person chooses to live in this permanent shadow, and what toll does such a double life take? The interpreter stood in a dangerous limbo, a space where immense power collided with profound vulnerability. To understand why they chose to manipulate, we must look past the grand narratives of empire and into the human heart navigating an impossible landscape. Their motivations were rarely simple, often a tangled knot of survival, ambition, faith, and a desperate hope to control a world that saw them as a mere instrument. Personal gain was a constant, tantalizing shadow. For an interpreter plucked from obscurity or even captivity, the role was a precarious ladder. A well-placed mistranslation could be their ticket to the top. A rival power eager to sway negotiations might offer a secret bribe, a chest of silver delivered under cover of night, or a promise of fertile land and a noble title in a new kingdom. The interpreter had to weigh this immediate, tangible reward against the abstract loyalty to a distant monarch. For some, the calculation was clear. A whispered alteration in a trade clause could secure a fortune, while a softened threat could earn the lifelong gratitude and patronage of a foreign prince. The risk of discovery was mortal, but the potential escape from a life of servitude or anonymity was a powerful siren song. Yet for others, the currency was not gold but conviction. Ideological and religious beliefs ran deep, and an interpreter could see themselves not as a traitor, but as a secret guardian of a higher truth. In the fractured world of medieval Spain, a place of intricate coexistence and tension between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities, this drama played out in whispers. Consider a Jewish interpreter serving a Christian king during negotiations with a Muslim emirate. His community lived under the often precarious tolerance of Christian rule, facing periods of hardship and suspicion. From his unique vantage point, he might believe that a stronger Muslim position in the region would lead to a more stable, traditionally tolerant environment for his people. So, when translating, he might subtly favor the emir's proposals, framing them as more reasonable or advantageous than they truly were. He might downplay a Christian demand he knew would be particularly offensive to Islamic law. This was not betrayal for profit, but a clandestine act of community survival, a gamble that by tilting the diplomatic scales, he could secure a safer future for his family and faith. He served one master with his voice, but another with his conscience. Then there was the most immediate motive of all, the raw instinct to see another sunrise. When a volatile warlord, known for his terrible temper, dictated a message so insulting it guaranteed a violent response, the interpreter faced a horrifying dilemma. Deliver the message faithfully, and they might be the first casualty of the ensuing rage, killed on the spot as the bearer of bad news. Alter the message to soothe, and they might live another day, even if it meant betraying their technical duty. This was manipulation born not from greed or ideology, but from sheer primal self-preservation. In these moments, the interpreter was not a master strategist, but a cornered individual making a split-second decision to survive the fury of the powerful. Paradoxically, a twisted sense of patriotism could also motivate the deception. An interpreter might genuinely believe their king was making a terrible mistake, being too weak in a demand or too generous in an offer. By secretly hardening the language or altering a key term, they could engineer a more favorable outcome, or even provoke a breakdown they felt would ultimately benefit their homeland by preventing a perceived bad deal. They saw themselves as silent correctors of royal error, protecting the kingdom from its own leaders' poor judgment. This paternalistic arrogance placed them in the role of a shadow sovereign, believing they alone could see the true path to national glory. Understanding these motives transforms the interpreter from a mysterious functionary into a deeply relatable, if flawed, historical actor. They were individuals caught in the crosscurrents of competing loyalties to their ruler, their faith, their community, their family, and their own life. Every whispered translation was a negotiation with themselves first, a private calculus of risk and reward where the stakes were their soul, their safety, or their vision of a better world. This human drama, pulsing beneath the dry text of treaties, forces us to ask a final, haunting question. In a system built on such fragile trust, how could any ruler ever hope to know the truth? The shadowy craft of the interpreter finds its most dramatic stage not in a European castle, but on the vast, windswept plains of Asia. In the middle of the 13th century, a terrifying new power erupted onto the world stage. The Mongol Empire, under the successors of Genghis Khan, had conquered from the Pacific to the gates of Europe. Their armies were unstoppable, their intentions a mystery cloaked in rumor and fear. In desperation, Pope Innocent IV and various European monarchs made a breathtaking decision. They would not just fight, they would talk. They sent envoys, Franciscan friars like Giovanni da Pian del Carpine and William of Rubruck, on an epic journey eastward. These brave men carried letters demanding the Mongols cease their attacks, submit to papal authority, and accept baptism. It was a diplomatic mission born of equal parts hope and profound ignorance. The friars themselves did not speak a word of the Mongol tongue. Their entire strategy, and perhaps the fate of Christendom's relationship with the East, rested entirely on the skills and loyalties of the interpreters they would find along the way. This was not a clean negotiation between equals with their own trusted linguists. This was a venture into the unknown, where every word had to pass through multiple hands, through chains of translation that were ripe for manipulation. The friars often had to rely on interpreters who were themselves captives, Nestorian Christians or Muslims who had been living under Mongol rule for years, even decades. These individuals understood the Mongol court, its customs, and its dangerous politics in a way the Europeans never could. Their survival depended on the Khan's pleasure. So when the Pope's stark ultimatum, a demand for spiritual and political submission, was placed before them to translate for the great Khan, they faced an impossible choice. To deliver the message verbatim was to invite catastrophe. The Khan, who saw himself as the ruler of the world by divine mandate, would have viewed such a demand as the height of insanity and insult. The likely response would have been immediate, violent rejection, and the envoys might well have paid with their lives. Historians studying the accounts of these missions note a fascinating and critical gap. The Khan's recorded replies, while firm, do not reflect the blistering fury one would expect from such a direct challenge. Instead, they speak of alliance and mutual recognition. This suggests the interpreters performed a masterful act of strategic filtering. They likely transformed the Pope's demands for submission and baptism into a far softer proposal, perhaps framing it as a request for friendship or a discussion of shared spiritual values. The toxic language of command was replaced with the more palatable vocabulary of potential partnership. This single act of linguistic intervention had world-shaping consequences. It almost certainly saved the lives of the friars and allowed the dialogue to continue, but more importantly, it fundamentally shaped how the Mongol Khans perceived Europe. They did not come away seeing a spiritual superior issuing commands from Rome. They saw, as their replies indicate, a collection of distant princes who might be potential vassals or tributary states. The entire religious dimension of the conflict, the core of the Pope's message, was subtly erased from the record. A Nestorian interpreter whose own Christian faith existed outside of Roman authority might have had little desire to promote the Pope's supremacy. A local translator dependent on Mongol goodwill had every reason to soften a message that threatened his patrons. This case lays bare the terrifying power of the intermediary. A geopolitical and religious dialogue that could have defined centuries of conflict was quietly, irrevocably altered in the space between one man's hearing and another's speech. The bridge they built was not one of understanding, but of calculated misdirection. It allowed both sides to walk away with a completely different story of what had just been said, setting a course for a relationship built not on clarity, but on a foundation of profound and purposeful misunderstanding. The frontier between the Byzantine Empire and the Arab caliphates was a world of its own, a 1,000-mile seam of sand, stone, and suspicion. For over 500 years, this borderland simmered with a complex rhythm of trade, espionage, and sudden, brutal conflict. And holding this fragile world together was a unique class of linguists, the frontier interpreters known as dragomans. They were the living, breathing operating system for a divided region, and their story reveals the ultimate evolution of the interpreter's craft, from passive translator to active architect of military outcomes. These individuals were almost always cultural hybrids. Many were Syriac Christians, members of an ancient community that had thrived in the region long before either empire arrived. Others were Greco-Arabic bilinguals born in the bustling, mixed cities of the frontier. This gave them an intimate, internal map of both worlds, understanding not just the languages of Constantinople and Damascus, but the subtle codes of honor, the unspoken gestures of respect, and the deep-seated fears that motivated each side. Yet this very hybridity made them permanent outsiders. To the Byzantine general, the dragoman was a useful tool who understood the enemy a little too well. To the Arab emir, he was a potential asset whose true loyalty might forever lie with his Christian roots. They lived in the ambiguous space between identities, trusted by neither side but needed by both. This precarious position forced them to become masters of a dangerous double game, where survival depended on proving their value through acts of spectacular and often secret utility. One chronicle from the 10th century borderlands tells a story that cuts to the heart of this shadowy role. During a tense truce negotiation between a Byzantine strategos, a military governor, and an Arab emir, the topic turned to the strength of the local Byzantine garrison. The emperor in Constantinople had actually reinforced the frontier forts, sending fresh troops to deter aggression. The Byzantine commander, following a clever strategy of appearing strong to maintain the peace, intended to hint at this bolstered force. But the dragoman, a Syriac Christian in the emir's service, made a critical choice in the moment of translation. When the strategos spoke of the garrison's robust numbers, the dragoman deliberately halved the figure in his Arabic rendering. He presented a picture of vulnerability, not strength. His motive was not treason, but a breathtakingly audacious gamble. He believed, or perhaps had been secretly instructed, that a weaker-appearing Byzantine position would tempt the ambitious emir into breaking the truce and launching an attack. And that attack against the actual, much larger Byzantine force would end in a costly failure for the Arabs. The dragoman's goal was not to cause a Byzantine defeat, but to engineer an Arab one. By provoking a rash assault that was destined to fail, he would strengthen his true patron's position on the frontier, discredit a rival emir, and demonstrate his own indispensable value as a strategist who could shape battles with words. This was the interpreter's role elevated to its most active form, military deception. He was no longer just filtering messages or softening tones. He was injecting false intelligence directly into the decision-making process of a rival commander. The Chronicle does not record the outcome of this specific ruse, but the logic of the ploy is chillingly clear. It shows a mind thinking several moves ahead on the geopolitical chessboard, using language not to bridge a gap but to lay a trap. For the Dragoman, every negotiation was a battlefield, and every translated sentence was a maneuver. Their deep cultural knowledge was the weapon. They knew precisely what piece of information would trigger an Arab leader's sense of opportunity or a Byzantine commander's fear of betrayal. This constant performance took a profound personal toll. To maintain their cover and their utility, they had to cultivate genuine relationships on both sides, all while knowing they might one day have to sacrifice those very connections for a larger strategy. They were professional paradoxes, building trust only to exploit it, fostering communication while planning deception. Their legacy is the frontier itself, a place where understanding and manipulation were two sides of the same coin, and where the most powerful person in the room was often the one who said nothing in his own voice. Their world was built not on trust but on meticulously curated information. To navigate the perilous space between rival courts, an interpreter's most valuable assets were the tools they carried, and more importantly, the ones they carried within. Forget the idea of a modern, standardized dictionary. In the medieval world, such a reference for translating between, say, Frankish and Arabic simply did not exist. Instead, each linguist was an archive unto themselves, compiling a personal, portable library of words and worlds. This was the interpreter's secret toolkit, a blend of scholarly discipline and clandestine tradecraft. The most common item was the personal glossary, a handwritten notebook or scroll that grew organically over a lifetime of travel and negotiation. Imagine a worn parchment carried by a Eurasian interpreter journeying the Silk Road. This single scroll, his Silk Road lexicon, might contain columns of equivalent terms in Uyghur, Persian, Chinese, and Greek. It listed not just words for horse or silver, but crucial titles, intricate forms of polite address, and ceremonial phrases for a dozen different courts. This was a map of social hierarchy, not just language. A mistake in addressing a Ming dynasty official could end a mission before it began, so these glossaries were lifelines, constantly updated with hard-won knowledge. But such a document was also a liability. If captured, it revealed the interpreter's entire mental framework. To protect themselves, some developed private annotation systems, a kind of code. Tiny, almost invisible marks in the margin, a dot here, a dash there, could signal which phrases to soften, which demands to subtly strengthen, or which cultural concepts required creative explanation. A circle around a word might mean handle with extreme care, potential for grave insult. These coded notes transformed a simple vocabulary list into a manual for controlled communication, a guide for navigating the emotional minefield of diplomacy. Yet paper could be lost or seized. The interpreter's ultimate, unassailable tool was their own memory. They cultivated a phenomenal, disciplined capacity to retain hours of complex, multi-speaker dialogue and reproduce it with chilling accuracy or with deliberate, strategic deviations. Training this faculty was relentless. It involved reciting epic poems to build stamina, engaging in language immersion so deep they began to dream in the foreign tongue, and most critically, mastering the courtly style of each culture. This was far more than vocabulary. It was the intricate dance of protocol, the precise order of titles, the specific poetic metaphors used to convey respect, and the subtle gradations of humility required when addressing a superior. Learning this style was like learning the rules of a sacred ritual. A misplaced honorific was not a simple error. It could be interpreted as a deliberate act of disrespect, a challenge to the ruler's very legitimacy. An interpreter's value was measured by their ability to make their patron sound flawlessly noble, perfectly respectful, and formidably intelligent in a foreign linguistic realm. They were, in essence, ghostwriters for empire, using their hidden tools to compose the official soundtrack of international relations, one carefully recalled and artfully delivered phrase at a time. This immense mental burden, however, created a unique vulnerability. A perfect memory was a prison for secrets, and those secrets could become chains. This constant performance demanded a terrible personal price. To be the bridge between worlds was to live in a permanent state of fracture, a psychological tightrope where one misstep meant ruin. The interpreter's mind became a vault of conflicting secrets, their true self buried beneath layers of calculated performance. Imagine the private anguish of a translator who, over years of negotiations, had developed a genuine friendship with a foreign envoy, admiring his wit and honor. Then his own king orders him to plant a subtle, destabilizing lie into the next day's dialogue, a deception designed to humiliate that very friend and sabotage his mission. His duty commands betrayal while his conscience pleads for loyalty. Which voice does he obey when the moment comes to speak? There was no clean escape from this conflict, only the corrosive stress of maintaining a flawless facade. Every lie, every softened threat, every creatively explained concept had to be remembered and kept consistent across meetings that could be months or even years apart. A single forgotten detail, a contradictory phrase uttered in a moment of fatigue, could unravel the entire delicate tapestry of deception. The fear of such a slip-up was a constant, low hum of anxiety, a companion in every silent moment. This pressure bred a profound and isolating loneliness. In any negotiation chamber, the interpreter was the only person who truly understood the full picture, hearing the unvarnished words of one side and crafting the curated message for the other. They held the complete truth in their mind, yet could share it with no one. There was no colleague to confide in, no superior to seek guidance from without revealing their own manipulations. They were solitary guardians of a reality they had helped to distort. Historical fragments and personal accounts hint at how this burden manifested. Some interpreters, seeking solace or escape, turned deeply to spiritual or mystical practices, perhaps searching for a higher truth to absolve them of their daily deceptions. Others, chronicles suggest, found a different kind of relief in drink, using it to quiet the internal noise of their double life. For many, the most common adaptation was a more disturbing transformation. The constant need to read, manipulate, and outthink everyone in the room could harden into a permanent worldview. The art of deception ceased to be a professional tool and became a personal instinct. They might begin to see all human interaction as a series of moves and countermoves, approaching even family and friends with the same calculating, strategic mindset that kept them alive at court. The very skills that made them masters of discourse, empathy, and psychological insight could curdle into a pervasive cynicism, leaving them brilliant at connection but incapable of trust. In this light, they were not just manipulators of empires but tragic figures of their own making. They wielded the power to redefine reality for kings, yet became prisoners within the labyrinth of identities they had constructed. Every whispered word in a foreign tongue was a brick in a wall that separated them from ever being fully known, forever caught between the worlds they so expertly navigated but could never truly call home. The shadow of the executioner's axe was the final, silent participant in every negotiation. For all their power, royal interpreters lived under one unbreakable law. If their manipulations were discovered, their utility vanished in an instant, replaced by a ferocious need for retribution. The punishment was never private. It was a public spectacle, a brutal lesson for any who might consider following the same treacherous path. In the sophisticated yet ruthless court of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a master of languages himself, one interpreter learned this lesson in the most final way. He was tasked with conveying a series of messages between the emperor and the pope, a relationship already strained to its limit, seeking some personal advantage, or perhaps swayed by a hidden patron. The interpreter deliberately altered the tone of a papal communique, making a stern warning sound like a passive observation. Frederick, deeply familiar with Latin and suspicious by nature, detected the discrepancy. The interpreter's fate was sealed. He was subjected to intense interrogation to uncover his network and motives, and then publicly executed. His remains were displayed at the city gates, a stark warning about the cost of betraying the sovereign's ear. This was the core truth of their profession. They were indispensable until the moment they were not. To manage this existential risk, rulers devised crude but effective methods of detection. The most common was the use of a second, rival interpreter. A monarch would secretly employ another linguist, often from a different faction or school, to listen in and provide a separate translation of the proceedings. This created a system of competitive verification, where each interpreter knew they were potentially being watched by a colleague who would gain everything by exposing their errors. It was a climate of profound professional paranoia. Another cunning test involved the fabrication of a false secret message. A ruler would compose a note containing specific, verifiable instructions or claims, then have it accidentally fall into the hands of a suspected interpreter or his associates. If those details later appeared in the enemy's position or public knowledge, the leak was traced back to its source with terrible certainty. Some particularly savvy rulers, like Frederick, took a more direct approach. They would learn a handful of keywords or phrases in the other language terms for war, gold, surrender, or alliance. During a translation, they would listen intently for those specific sounds. If the interpreter consistently softened a word they knew meant ultimatum, or failed to mention a term they recognized for tribute, the deception was laid bare. This ever-present threat of exposure, with its horrific consequences, shaped every single choice an interpreter made. It was the counterweight to ambition, the cold restraint on ideology. A potential bribe had to be weighed not just against duty, but against the very real prospect of a torturous public end. That pressure, the knowledge that a single misremembered detail or a rival's jealousy could lead to the executioner's block, lived in their bones. It made them cautious calculators, their brilliant, duplicitous minds constantly running a secondary script, assessing not just the meaning of words, but the survival odds of each possible rendering. In the end, their greatest protection was the very complexity they mastered. The fog of language was both their weapon and their shield, a gray area in which they could always claim honest mistake. But when that fog cleared and a monarch's gaze fell upon them with cold certainty, they stood utterly alone, a discarded instrument whose final, silent translation was the universal language of power asserting its brutal control. So we arrive at the central, haunting question left by these whispered histories. Were these interpreters traitors, or were they simply performing the darker, unsanctioned duties of statecraft? The medieval world itself held no single answer, and the ethical framework they navigated was a shifting landscape of loyalty, faith, and necessity. On one side stood the formidable concept of the prince's will. In this view, the interpreter was not an independent actor, but an extension of the sovereign's own voice and strategy, a living instrument. Their duty was to serve the interests of their patron, and if those interests were best served by creative translation or selective omission, then that was not betrayal, but a form of loyal cunning. Some scholars of the period, like Thomas Aquinas, wrestled with similar ideas in their writings on just war and governance, contemplating whether deception in service of a righteous cause for one's community could be permissible. From this perspective, an interpreter who softened a message to prevent a disastrous war was not a liar but a patriot, using the tools at his disposal to steer his kingdom toward safety. He was a pragmatist operating in a world where absolute honesty could mean absolute ruin. Yet a powerful counter-argument existed. rooted in the very sanctity of language itself. For many medieval thinkers, words were not merely sounds, they were vessels of divine truth and human covenant. To deliberately corrupt their passage was to violate a sacred trust. This view held the interpreter not as a tool, but as a guardian, a keeper of the bridge of understanding upon which peace and goodwill depended. In this light, every strategic mistranslation was a moral failing, a personal choice that corrupted the soul and endangered the possibility of true accord between peoples. The interpreter, therefore, bore a profound personal moral agency, regardless of the pressures from the throne. This ancient debate echoes powerfully into our own time. We see its reflection in modern dilemmas of diplomatic spin, in the ethical lines crossed in intelligence gathering, and in the responsibilities of media and translators in an age of global information. It forces us to ask, where exactly does the line fall between loyal service and unethical manipulation when vital interests are at stake? Is the individual who bends the truth for a perceived greater good a hero or a villain? The royal interpreters of history lived in that gray expanse, their every decision a private answer to that impossible question. Their legacy is not a verdict, but an enduring mirror, challenging us to consider the price of understanding in a world where power and truth are so rarely aligned. These quiet manipulations left a permanent scar on the historical record. The treaties and agreements they crafted were not simple contracts. They were time capsules of strategic misunderstanding, and when opened by future generations, they released conflict. A peace accord signed under manipulated terms did not end a grievance. It merely preserved it, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout into a new war. Consider the complex marriage alliances of medieval Europe, intended to bind kingdoms through blood. In the early 14th century, a pivotal union between the royal houses of England and France was negotiated with immense hope. The intricate terms of succession, detailing which descendants could claim which thrones, were passed through multiple interpreters across linguistic and legal traditions. Research suggests that subtle variances in the translation of key phrases, perhaps around the words direct line or rightful heir, created a fatal ambiguity. Each side, for generations, held a different, legally justifiable interpretation of the same document. What was meant to unite became a litany of contested claims, a direct and traceable fuse that helped ignite the long, devastating conflict we now call the 100 Years' War. The interpreters did not start that war, but by embedding a critical lack of clarity into its founding charter, they ensured it was almost inevitable. Their work turned a bridge into a battleground. This pattern of encoded conflict repeated along the frozen frontiers of Eastern Europe. The Teutonic Knights, a powerful Germanic crusading order, constantly negotiated and clashed with the Kingdom of Poland and the Duchy of Lithuania. Treaties delineating borders, fishing rights, and toll passages were painstakingly translated between German, Polish, and Latin. Chroniclers from the period note that disputes almost always arose not from outright refusal, but from conflicting readings of the agreed text. A Polish chronicle would quote a clause guaranteeing access to a river, while the Teutonic copy referenced a regulated toll for the same passage. This was likely the fruit of deliberate ambiguity, where interpreters for each side chose the most favorable rendering of a vague original phrase. The result was a permanent state of low-grade conflict, a simmering tension that flared into raids and reprisals for over a century. Every broken agreement could be blamed on the other side's bad faith, while the true culprit, the intentionally muddied language, remained safely in the shadows. In this way, these hidden authors did not just influence events, they designed the very frameworks for future discord. They built legal labyrinths where every path led back to dispute. The parchment might be signed and sealed, but the meaning within was left deliberately unstable, a ghost in the machinery of statecraft that would rattle and shake the peace for generations to come. But this power could not go unchecked. Aware of the immense risk resting on a single voice, cunning monarchs devised intricate systems to guard against their own linguists. They built cages of loyalty around the interpreter, transforming the very act of translation into a high-stakes performance under constant review. One of the most straightforward, yet psychologically brutal, methods was the hostage system. An interpreter's family, their spouse, children, or parents, would be taken under royal protection, housed comfortably but unmistakably within the sovereign's grasp. Their safety and comfort became the direct collateral for the interpreter's faithful service. A single whispered betrayal discovered meant not just personal execution, but unimaginable consequences for those held as guarantee. This tactic weaponized the most basic human instinct, love, and turned it into the most powerful enforcement mechanism imaginable. It forced the interpreter to weigh every creative translation against the safety of their own blood, a calculation that almost always favored absolute, literal fidelity. In a more subtle vein, some rulers, like the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, employed a system of competitive verification. He would hire not one, but a small team of interpreters for a critical mission, deliberately selecting them from rival political factions, different religious orders, or competing linguistic schools. These men knew each other, distrusted each other, and understood that exposing a rival's error or deceit was the surest path to royal favor and their colleagues' ruin. This created a panopticon of mutual suspicion. During a negotiation, each interpreter would be listening not only to the foreign dignitary, but to his counterpart's rendering of the words, poised to pounce on any deviation. The act of translation became a public examination, with the king as the final judge. This environment of professional paranoia severely limited an interpreter's room for creative maneuvering, as any significant alteration would be immediately challenged from within his own ranks. The Byzantine Empire, master of courtly intrigue, developed an even more institutional solution. They frequently entrusted sensitive diplomatic and interpretive roles to eunuchs. The reasoning was coldly pragmatic. Eunuchs, removed from the traditional path of founding a dynasty, were seen as owing their entire status, wealth, and identity to the imperial court itself. They had no external family lineage to prioritize, no children for whom to build a legacy outside the palace walls. Their loyalty, it was believed, could be more absolute, funneled entirely toward the emperor who was the source of their power. While not foolproof, this practice aimed to engineer a class of servants whose personal ambitions were perfectly aligned with the throne's interests, minimizing the pull of conflicting loyalties. Perhaps the most cunning counter-strategy of all was the deployment of the Silent Auditor. A king or sultan would place a trusted, often highly educated advisor in the negotiation chamber. This individual possessed a strong command of the foreign language but would pretend to have no understanding at all. To all eyes, he was just another nobleman, observing the proceedings with a polite, vacant expression. His true role was that of a secret witness, listening to the original statements and comparing them meticulously to the interpreter's official translation. Any discrepancy, any softening or hardening of tone, any strategic omission would be noted and reported privately to the monarch. The interpreter, operating under the illusion of being the sole linguistic authority in the room, was in fact performing for a hidden critic whose sole purpose was to uncover deception. This practice turned trust into a trap, making every negotiation a covert test of the interpreter's honesty. Together, these methods created a suffocating climate of surveillance. The interpreter was no longer a bridge between two powers, but a node in a web of control, watched by rivals, bound by hostages, and silently judged by unseen auditors. The negotiation chamber became a psychological prison, where the translator who held so much power was himself the most closely monitored individual present. forever balancing on the knife's edge between indispensable service and catastrophic disgrace. That long shadow falls directly across the polished tables of modern diplomacy. We may have swapped parchment for encrypted tablets and royal courts for summit halls, but the fundamental dance of power through words remains eerily familiar. Today's professional interpreters are bound by strict codes of ethics, sworn to neutrality and pinpoint accuracy, a direct institutional response to the very manipulations we have explored. They are trained to be transparent conduits, their personal beliefs and political leanings meticulously checked at the door. This professionalization was hard-won, born from centuries of understanding how a single skewed phrase could derail peace. Yet, even with this fortress of ethics, the ancient dilemmas have not vanished. They have simply changed their clothes. The challenge of nuance is omnipresent. Take a word like regret in a carefully crafted diplomatic statement. In English, it can range from a mild apology to a profound acknowledgement of fault. Translating that term into another language requires the interpreter to choose the closest equivalent on that spectrum, a choice that can subtly tilt the emotional weight of an entire message. They must navigate these shades of meaning in real time, under the glare of international media, with the knowledge that their word choice will be analyzed by experts in foreign ministries across the globe. It is a pressure the medieval linguist would recognize instantly. Furthermore, while the interpreter's role has been purified, the advisor's role has expanded. The modern equivalent of the royal interpreter's creative power often lies not with the translator, but with the speechwriter, the communications director, or the senior policy advisor. These are the figures who shape the message before it ever reaches the interpreter's ear. They decide which historical parallels to invoke, which cultural references to include, and how to frame a demand to make it palatable or formidable to a specific audience. They perform the strategic editing and cultural explanation once done in the moment of translation, but now in the quiet of an office weeks before a summit. This is the sanctioned, institutionalized version of the old craft. The lesson from history is not that manipulation disappeared, but that it often migrated upstream, becoming a core, acknowledged part of preparing for dialogue. We see this in the careful choreography of modern summits, where every handshake, every seating arrangement, and every adjective in a joint statement is negotiated in advance. The interpreter today delivers a finished product, but teams of advisors have already done the work of the medieval linguist, sanding down rough edges and building conceptual bridges. This reveals the enduring truth those ancient figures understood in their bones. In statecraft, language is never a neutral pipeline, it is a strategic asset. Controlling its flow, its tone, and its framing is not a peripheral concern. It is the very essence of the game. Whether in the candlelit chambers of Constantinople or the sterile press rooms of Geneva, the goal remains the same: to use words to construct a desired reality. The ghost of the royal interpreter reminds us that behind every clear communication lies a history of deliberate choices, and that the most powerful person in the room is still sometimes the one who decides what words mean. This power to construct reality finds a name in modern linguistics. The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, or linguistic relativity, suggests the language we speak shapes how we think and perceive the world. Those royal interpreters were not just proving this theory, they were weaponizing it. By controlling the very vocabulary available to each ruler, they did more than influence a deal. They constrained the entire universe of possible outcomes. Think of language as the operating system for thought. If your system lacks a certain program, you cannot run it. An interpreter, serving as the system administrator, could decide which programs, which concepts, were even installed in the diplomatic conversation. Imagine a negotiation where one culture's language had no direct word for compromise, framing all disagreements as contests with a clear victor and a clear loser. An interpreter aware of this gap could choose a path. they might laboriously explain the foreign idea of mutual concession, building a new cognitive pathway. Or more likely, they might simply avoid introducing the concept altogether, allowing the talks to proceed within the familiar and more confrontational win-lose framework. This was gatekeeping on a profound level. The interpreter decided which ideas crossed the bridge and which were left stranded on the far shore, invisible to the other side. A stunning example lies in the encounters between European envoys and the Mongol Khans. The Mongols had a complex political vocabulary born of the steppe, with terms for leadership that intertwined military command, tribal loyalty, and a mandate from the eternal blue sky. When a Franciscan friar referred to the Pope or a European king, he used words laden with Roman law and Christian theology. The interpreter in the middle faced a monumental task of conceptual translation. Choosing to render the Khan's title as emperor imposed a very specific, Roman-derived political ontology onto a nomadic tradition. It framed the Khan as a sovereign in a European mold, with subjects, fixed borders, and a hereditary court. This was a cognitive imposition. It forced European listeners to understand Mongol power through their own familiar framework, potentially missing its fluid, merit-based, and deeply personal nature entirely. Conversely, translating the Pope's title as a type of high priest or spiritual elder might have radically diminished his perceived temporal authority in Mongol eyes. With every such choice, the interpreter was not translating a pre-existing reality. They were actively constructing the conceptual world in which the diplomacy occurred. They built the shared mental stage, selected the props, and even subtly directed the actors, all while remaining unseen in the wings. Their most profound manipulation was not of words, but of the very categories of thought that made peace or war conceivable. The royal court held a second, quieter stage for diplomacy, one that unfolded not in grand halls but in private chambers and secluded gardens. While official chronicles celebrated the male interpreters who stood beside kings, a parallel network of influence was being woven by women, whose linguistic skill operated from within the very heart of domestic and dynastic life. Their power was born from a unique form of access, granting them a perspective no male envoy could ever hope to achieve. When a princess was sent across mountains or seas to seal an alliance through marriage, she did not travel alone. Among her most trusted companions were bilingual handmaidens, women who were far more than servants. They were her voice, her memory, and her secret channel to the world she left behind. In the unfamiliar court of her new husband, these interpreters became her lifeline, translating not just language, but the unspoken rules of custom, the hidden tensions of the household, and the true intentions behind polite smiles. They occupied a space between worlds, trusted by their mistress and gradually, through proximity and necessity, by the new royal family as well. This position made them indispensable and quietly formidable. Consider the story of an Armenian woman serving in the 11th century court of the Byzantine Empress. Fluent in Greek, Armenian, and the languages of the Caucasus, she moved with ease between the Empress's private apartments and the visiting delegations of Georgian nobles. Official male translators handled the public ceremonies, but the most delicate conversations, the ones concerning potential rebellions, discreet financial support, or marriage proposals for lesser princes, were conducted in confidence through her. She could carry messages during a walk in the palace gardens or a private religious service, places where male diplomats would raise immediate suspicion. Her reports to the Empress did not just convey words, they included crucial context, the noble's tone when speaking of his rivals, the anxiety in his wife's questions about safety, the gifts he considered too meager to offer publicly. This intelligence, gleaned from the informal, interpersonal sphere, allowed the Byzantine throne to craft responses with surgical precision, offering support exactly where it would be most effective, or applying pressure where it would be most keenly felt. She was not just a translator, she was a confidential broker, shaping policy from within the palace's inner sanctum. Operating with less official scrutiny than their male counterparts, these women interpreters leveraged their perceived domesticity as a shield. Because they were not seen as formal political actors, their movements and conversations were often overlooked by the court's usual spies and auditors. This granted them a remarkable freedom to soften hostilities or broker understandings that official channels had deadlocked. A harsh word from a king to his new foreign bride, spoken in frustration, could be gently reframed by her handmaiden into a concern for household management. A princess's heartfelt plea to her husband for clemency toward her homeland could be expertly translated to appeal directly to his sense of dynasty and legacy, rather than mere politics. They became the essential grease in the gears of interdynastic relations, preventing the personal from exploding into the political. Their influence was the very essence of soft power, exercised through persuasion, cultural translation, and the building of personal trust over years of intimate service. Their stories compel us to widen our lens on medieval statecraft. Diplomacy was not confined to treaties and troop movements. It pulsed through marriage alliances, gift exchanges between queens, and the education of royal children. In all these spaces, women with linguistic gifts held decisive sway. They ensured a foreign queen could advocate for her own interests. They helped raise bilingual princes who would one day rule, and they maintained the confidential correspondence that kept far-flung kinship networks alive. To overlook their role is to misunderstand half the machinery of international relations in the medieval world. They remind us that power has always flowed through multiple channels, and sometimes the most effective bridge between empires was built not in the council chamber, but in the quiet conversation between two women, one who needed to be understood and another who held the key to making it so. This deep societal unease is written into the very stories medieval people told themselves. In the tapestry of literature and myth, the interpreter appears not as a hero, but as a figure of profound ambiguity, a walking question mark about the nature of truth itself. Chivalric romances and epic poems are littered with what we might call the archetype of the false translator. These characters are rarely noble knights or wise kings. Instead, they are often servants, merchants, or renegade monks, defined by their cunning and their moral flexibility. Their linguistic skill is a tool for personal advancement or covert sabotage, a means to twist the plot toward betrayal. This portrayal speaks volumes about a culture that depended on these individuals yet fundamentally distrusted the power they wielded in the shadows. In the stark, tragic verses of the Song of Roland, written down in the 11th century, we see this fear realized. The poem recounts the legendary rear-guard action of Charlemagne's knight Roland in the Pyrenees. The disaster is precipitated by an act of treachery from the Frankish lord Gainlon. While Gainlon is not an interpreter by trade, his pivotal act is one of catastrophic miscommunication. Sent to negotiate with the Muslim king Marsil, Gainlon deliberately twists the message. He presents Charlemagne's terms in a way he knows will be received as an unforgivable insult, ensuring the Saracens will attack Roland's vulnerable force. The poet does not need a professional linguist to make the point. The story itself is a parable about the deadly potential of corrupted dialogue. It reflects a medieval worldview where the space between languages was not a bridge, but a treacherous gap where honor could be lost and armies doomed through manipulated words. The interpreter, in the public imagination, was the natural inhabitant of that dangerous gap. This suspicion stands in stark contrast to the sacred portrayals found in religious texts. Here, the gift of tongues is a divine miracle, a sign of holy favor that allows for the pure, unmediated spread of truth. Saints like Jerome, who translated the Bible into Latin, or Cyril and Methodius, who created the Glagolitic alphabet to bring scripture to the Slavs, are depicted as divine instruments. Their multilingualism is not a craft learned for courtly service, but a spiritual channel opened by faith. They are not negotiators between rival powers, but bridges between humanity and the divine word. This holy polyglot is the idealized inverse of the courtly interpreter, one serving God's unchanging truth, the other serving the shifting interests of princes. This dichotomy reveals society's deep ambivalence. The interpreter was simultaneously necessary and suspect, powerful yet often of low social status. They held the keys to kingdoms but were rarely granted a throne. Their expertise was coveted, but their character was perpetually in question. This tension is palpable in the travelogues of the most famous medieval wanderer, Marco Polo. Throughout his descriptions of the wonders of the East, the presence of interpreters is a constant, quiet subtext. Polo himself likely knew only a few languages, relying on a chain of translators to communicate across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire. His narrative is filtered through these unknown individuals, a fact he occasionally hints at with phrases about the difficulty of rendering foreign concepts. The very existence of his book, dictated to a Romance writer while imprisoned, is a testament to layers of interpretation, from spoken Mongol to Persian to Italian, and finally to the written page. Readers of his time would have understood that the dazzling accounts of Xanadu and the court of Kublai Khan arrived through a fragile human chain of meaning, each link potentially bending the truth. These cultural artifacts, from epic poems to travel memoirs, show that medieval people were not naive about the mechanics of communication. They were acutely, perhaps painfully, aware that understanding was never guaranteed. It was a fragile construct, built and maintained by fallible individuals who could, with a single chosen synonym, become architects of either concord or catastrophe. The interpreter in the medieval mind was thus cemented as the master of a dangerous, essential craft, forever balancing on the narrow ledge between a bridge and a weapon. The interpreter in ancient Rome was often a slave, his linguistic skill a commodity like any other. He stood in the forum translating for a merchant or a general, but his words carried little personal weight, for he had no power beyond his master's command. In the vast, centralized empires of antiquity, from Persia to Han China, the interpreter was a functional cog in a well-oiled imperial machine. He served an overwhelming, singular power that absorbed cultures and demanded conformity. His role was to transmit commands and collect information, not to shape policy. There was simply no room for a lone linguist to alter the monolithic will of an emperor who ruled by divine right over a unified territory. The medieval world shattered that model. Gone was the single, overwhelming sun of imperial authority, replaced by a constellation of competing stars, kings, popes, caliphs, and khans, each brilliant but none all-powerful. This fractured political landscape was the first ingredient in the perfect storm that created the uniquely potent medieval interpreter. He now operated in the interstices, the gaps between these rival powers. A king of France needed to speak to the Holy Roman Emperor, but neither could command the other's absolute obedience. They needed a bridge, and that bridge, the interpreter, found he could sway the traffic crossing it. Unlike the Roman slave, he often came from a distinct community with its own loyalties, a Nestorian Christian on the Silk Road or a Jewish scholar in Iberia, giving him a personal stake in the outcome that a mere functionary never possessed. The second ingredient was the explosion of cross-cultural contact along routes like the Silk Road and through the relentless movement of crusaders, pilgrims, and merchants. This constant friction between worlds created a desperate, continuous demand for linguistic go-betweens. It was no longer occasional translation for trade, but perpetual negotiation for survival, an advantage across a dozen different courts with a dozen different worldviews. Finally, the medieval era layered in profound ideological complexity absent in the ancient world. Now, an interpreter had to navigate not just political rivalry, but the explosive claims of competing universal religions, Christianity and Islam, each asserting an absolute truth. He also had to work within the intricate, often contradictory codes of chivalric honor, where a mistranslated insult could demand a duel, not just a diplomatic protest. This meant his manipulations could be motivated by faith as much as by gold, by a desire to protect a religious community or uphold a knightly ideal. The ancient interpreter translated for an empire. The medieval interpreter negotiated the very meaning of truth, faith, and honor between fractured powers that could never fully conquer one another. His agency was born from that fragile balance of power, a precarious equilibrium that gave his whispered words the weight to tip the scales of history. A single whispered word had a very specific price. The interpreter's craft was not just a service, it was a high-stakes commodity traded in the shadow economy of statecraft. The account books of royal treasuries and the private diaries of merchants reveal a bustling, often ruthless marketplace where linguistic skill was bought and sold. An interpreter's loyalty was not a given, it was a fluctuating asset, its value determined by the desperation of kings and the depth of rival treasuries. So, what was the going rate for peace? For a major, multi-day negotiation between rival empires, a top-tier interpreter could earn a sum equivalent to the annual income of a minor noble, perhaps several pounds of pure silver or gold. This was not a simple fee for labor, it was a retainer for immense responsibility and risk. Many royal interpreters were, in fact, kept on a permanent salary, paid from the sovereign's personal coffers to ensure their exclusive service. This salary was often sweetened with tangible symbols of trust and dependence, grants of fertile land, exemptions from onerous taxes, or the prestigious title of royal secretary. These were not just payments, they were bonds, tethering the interpreter's livelihood and social standing directly to the crown's favor. To betray that patron was to risk not just a job, but an entire hard-won life of privilege. Yet for every salaried court linguist, there were dozens of freelance operators on the volatile frontiers. In the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean or the caravan towns of the Silk Road, interpretation was a pure mercenary service. A merchant needing to negotiate a cargo contract, a local governor requiring talks with nomadic chieftains, a bishop seeking an audience with a Muslim emir, all would seek out the best linguist for hire. Reputation was everything. An interpreter known for accuracy and discretion could name his price, creating a bidding war between parties with conflicting interests. This is where the line between fee and bribe blurred into oblivion. Imagine a freelance interpreter hired by a Byzantine diplomat to facilitate talks with a Bulgar Khan. Midway through the negotiations, a rival faction within the Bulgar court, opposed to the peace, might discreetly offer the same interpreter double his agreed fee to subtly misrepresent a key Byzantine concession. The choice was stark and immediate: honor a contract with a distant empire, or accept a life-changing sum of gold from the man standing right in front of you. The chronicles are filled with veiled references to such transactions. Phrases like the interpreter was led astray by Turkish gold or the translator's sudden wealth raised many questions. Understanding this economic layer transforms the interpreter from a shadowy figure into a rational economic actor. Their decisions at the translation desk were not merely ideological or personal, they were often brutally financial calculations. The temptation to secure a family's future with one well-placed mistranslation, to leap from servitude to landed gentry in a single whispered afternoon, was a powerful, corrosive force. It made trust the most expensive commodity in the room, a luxury that constant, lavish payment could only hope to buy. Their power was built on a profound and deliberate silence, the silence of the unrecorded moment. In a world without audio capture or instant transcription, the interpreter's spoken word did not echo, it evaporated, leaving behind only the version they chose to inscribe. This was not a limitation of their era, it was the very foundation of their craft. A king or sultan could not press a button to replay a contentious phrase. They had only the interpreter's memory, his handwritten notes, and his solemn assurance to reconstruct a dialogue that had vanished into the air of the chamber. This ephemeral nature of communication granted the linguist a breathtaking power of retroactive adjustment. If a negotiated deal later collapsed into conflict, the interpreter could return to his patron with a plausible, face-saving correction. He might say, upon reflection, the foreign envoy's tone suggested a different intent, or that a key term had a secondary meaning he had initially overlooked. The original utterance was gone, leaving only his revised interpretation as the new, official truth. There was no objective record to contradict him. This ability to rewrite the past, to subtly shift the historical footing of an agreement after the fact, made the interpreter not just a messenger, but the final editor of reality. The slow, grinding pace of all communication magnified this effect exponentially. A diplomatic insult or a clever mistranslation uttered in Constantinople might take weeks to reach Cairo and months for a clarifying response to return. In that long, silent interval, the manipulated message would settle into the minds of courtiers and strategists. It would shape military deployments, influence treasury decisions, and harden into accepted fact long before any correction could arrive. By the time a query about a disputed term crossed deserts and seas, the political landscape had often already been reshaped by the lie. The manipulation became entrenched, its origins blurred by time and distance, making the eventual clarification seem like the real revision. This grace period was the interpreter's greatest shield. It allowed a seed of strategic falsehood to take root and grow into a formidable tree of policy before anyone could arrive to check the seed's true nature. Contrast this with our digital present. Today, sensitive negotiations often occur with audio recordings, verbatim transcripts, and even real-time translation software providing a baseline record. A diplomat's exact words are preserved, able to be analyzed, replayed, and scrutinized by teams of experts across the globe in seconds. This technological fidelity acts as a powerful constraint, a check on the kind of creative reinterpretation that was once routine. The modern interpreter's paramount duty is neutrality and precision, precisely because deviation is so easily detectable. The power has shifted from shaping the record to mastering the nuance within an immutable record. This reveals a core historical truth. The golden age of the royal interpreter was not merely a time of empires and intrigue. It was an age of profound informational scarcity. Their influence was inversely proportional to the fidelity of communication technology. They were the sovereigns of the gap between the spoken word and the settled account, and they ruled absolutely because in their world, that gap was a vast and uncharted wilderness. With their control over the fleeting moment now contextualized, we must finally look beyond the individuals to the systems they inhabited. How did the very structure of medieval courts and chanceries inadvertently enable this shadow craft to flourish? Every whispered lie in a negotiation chamber echoed in a far more terrifying arena, the court of divine judgment. In the medieval worldview, language was not a human invention to be bent at will. It was a sacred trust, a fragment of the divine logos itself. To corrupt it was to risk something far worse than a king's wrath. It was to sin against the very architecture of creation. This theological dimension wrapped the interpreter's work in a profound spiritual tension, forcing a question that haunted the most pragmatic linguist. Could God possibly approve of a lie told for peace? The Church's position was a labyrinth of nuance. On one hand, the very profession of interpreter was seen by some theologians as a redemptive act. The confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel was understood as a divine punishment for human arrogance, a fragmentation of understanding. Therefore, the interpreter who worked to rebuild that understanding, to allow different peoples to communicate, was participating in a godly mission of reconciliation. He was mending a crack in the human family caused by sin. But this holy sanction came with a non-negotiable condition: absolute fidelity to truth. The moment the interpreter shifted from bridge builder to manipulator, he crossed a dangerous theological line. Deliberate deception in translation was often classified among the most serious of spiritual offenses. Some church scholars, reflecting on the nature of the Holy Spirit as the source of all wisdom and understanding, argued that to intentionally twist meaning was to work directly against that spirit. It was not merely a political crime, it was a form of blasphemy, a corruption of a divine gift for earthly, and often sinful, ends. This framework transformed every negotiation from a simple act of statecraft into a personal spiritual trial. An interpreter standing between a wrathful king and a proud sultan wasn't just weighing survival against loyalty, he was weighing his mortal soul against the demands of the moment. The writings of St. Augustine, whose work profoundly shaped medieval thought, cast a long shadow here. Augustine, in his reflections on rhetoric and teaching, wrestled deeply with the ethics of communication. He condemned the use of eloquent speech to deceive, arguing that words must serve truth, not obscure it. For an educated interpreter, perhaps one trained in a monastic school, these ideas were not abstract philosophy, they were a direct indictment of his daily craft. He knew that the clever softening of a threat or the strategic omission of an insult, while pragmatically necessary, might constitute a mortal sin in the eyes of God. This fear left a tangible mark on the historical record, in the form of confessional manuals used by priests. These guides, which listed questions to ask penitents during confession, sometimes included specific inquiries for those in positions of verbal power. A priest might be instructed to ask a court functionary or translator, "Have you ever altered the words of a master to cause harm or gain favor? Have you used your knowledge of tongues to sow discord rather than peace?" The very existence of these questions reveals how recognized and how feared the interpreter's potential for sin truly was. This spiritual risk created a powerful internal counterweight to the temptations of gold or ambition. A bribe might secure a family's future on earth, but what was the cost to their eternal future? For the devout interpreter, the calculus of manipulation now had to include heaven and hell. It reframed their secret choices not merely as acts of political pragmatism, but as skirmishes in a cosmic battle between truth and falsehood, with their own soul as the contested ground. This added a layer of profound personal tragedy to their already fractured existence. They could be hailed as a peacemaker for their deceptions, yet lie awake at night terrified they had damned themselves in the process. Their legacy then becomes even more complex, a tapestry woven from threads of loyalty, survival, ambition, and a desperate, often silent, prayer for forgiveness. The echoes of their whispered choices have never truly faded. Our journey through these shadowed corridors reveals a figure who defies simple labels, a professional paradox who was both bridge and gatekeeper, truth teller and illusionist. The royal interpreter was not a mere conduit for words, but an architect of the very reality in which kings and sultans made their decisions. They built frameworks of understanding from the raw materials of alien tongues, and in the spaces between definitions, they wielded a quiet, formidable sovereignty. Their story teaches us that history is never just a record of what was said, but a complex tapestry of what was heard, filtered, and often creatively reimagined. The victors may write the chronicles, but the cunning, standing just off the page, often translated the terms of victory itself. From this exploration, several truths emerge with striking clarity. First, communication is, and always has been, a primary form of power. Controlling the flow, the tone, and the very definitions of words meant controlling the outcomes of peace and war. Second, the ideal of a perfectly neutral translator is a modern luxury born from hard lessons in a fractured past. In the medieval world, every interpreter carried a constellation of loyalties to faith, to community, to family, and to their own survival. Their work was inherently, unavoidably human. Finally, we see that language itself has always been a battlefield. The struggle was not merely over territory or treasure, but over meaning, over whose concepts would define the relationship between peoples. Every treaty was a negotiated reality, and its translators were the often unseen negotiators. These lessons from the candlelit chambers of the past resonate with uncanny force in our brightly lit present. We navigate our own landscape of global discourse where media narratives are spun, diplomatic statements are passed for hidden nuance, and cultural negotiations happen at lightning speed across digital platforms. The intermediaries have changed, but the fundamental dance remains. The ghost of the royal interpreter asks us to listen with a more critical ear, to value clarity in an age of noise, and to remember that behind every polished message lies a long history of human choices about what to say, what to soften, and what to leave unsaid entirely. Their legacy is a call to recognize the profound responsibility and the immense power inherent in the act of translation itself. If this dive into the hidden mechanics of history has sparked your curiosity, we would be honored to have you join us for more explorations. Let us know your thoughts below in this ongoing conversation across time. Do you believe true, unbiased communication can ever exist when the stakes are highest?